Okay, so today we'll be asking questions to each other, and then we'll share our thoughts. I'm a culture kid and living in different parts of the world.
So yeah, give me a little bit about your background, and then I will do the same.
Sounds good. So I was born in China, lived there until I was 15, which is finishing middle school in China. And then I moved to Canada to finish high school, and then moved to New York City for undergrad. And then after that, I actually moved back to Asia to work in Singapore, Hong Kong, and recently went back to Boston, so on the East Coast, to finish my MBA, and now I'm back in the city. So it's a whirlwind of traveling and moving around, but I am back.
I'm trying to remember all those places. Moving around, it's always been a challenge, but also fun because you get to explore new places, and especially as you start doing it in your younger years. I was born in the UK and then grew up mostly in Europe and Africa. So I lived in England, Iceland, Italy, France, Senegal, and Mauritius. Not in that order, though. But I finished high school in Paris. And then I ended up moving to the U.S. for college and have been here ever since. But I've lived in D.C., I lived in San Francisco, and now I've been in New York for about 5 years. So
amazing. That sounds fantastic. I feel like if we were to create a map and then pin all the places we lived in,
we might span the globe. I will say, though, I've never been to East Asia, and I haven't been to South America.
Absolutely worth visiting.
You mentioned you moved to Canada for high school, right?
Yeah.
What was that experience like for you, especially since that was probably one of your first very big moves?
I think it's kind of interesting thinking back because you're right, that was the first cross-cultural experience. And then just to add to that, I was also there by myself. I was not in a boarding school, but with a host family who is absolutely the most amazing people, like family in the world. They were just so open-minded to take me in, show me the culture, and they're actually Taiwanese Canadian, so They were bicultural to start with. So I definitely had that easy soft landing into a different culture. And then the years went on, like there were so many actually reverse cultural shocks, which I'm sure you've experienced as well in some ways. Just moving back and forth. But that very initial cultural shock, for sure. I actually barely spoke any English at the time.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, I learned English in school, but, I think in many East Asian countries, it's very textbook style of learning. So I could make sentences, I could take exams. I was really good at my English exams, but I could not speak a word for life. I remember distinctly in my 10th grade social science class, which is where you learn like history of Canada and all, like remembered nothing. But I remember sitting in class, opening a textbook that's this thick on English, and then very difficult words because it's not your colloquial English language. And I was like, no idea what to do. So one thing I learned was just to look around. Whenever the teacher says something, if everyone looks at a textbook and starts highlighting, I just look to my neighbor and be like, what are we supposed to do? And then she's like, oh, you highlight. I was like, okay. So I just did that to start. So at least I know what's learned in class. And then I'll like go home and I'll take out my thick dictionary, like physical dictionary. That was 2009. That was not the time you like Google everything.
Oh my God.
Smartphone was just becoming a thing, at least for me and my friends. So I would look up all these words and try to like understand the meaning of it. And somehow I just made my way through 10th grade and then decided to do International Baccalaureate, which is, again, was so hard for someone who is an ESL essentially. But I think at the time I definitely noticed that I was better at learning the language. Like I was learning it faster than people coming from my background. So I definitely thought, okay, this is something that I'm probably good at and I should just lean into it and learn as much as I can. And I do think learning the language is like learning the new culture. And now it's like I have different personalities, speaking different languages. So there's a whole lot behind that.
I agree. Even though I grew up speaking both English and French, since I was applying as an international student to college, I took the English as a foreign language exam, the TOEFL exam. And they said a lot of foreign students actually test higher when it comes to English because we're learning it in such a textbook format in school. Those tests are kind of really set up for those more literary style settings. Growing up multilingual has its benefits. I found that being immersed really helps, and I think that's one of the challenges that a lot of people face is that they learn a foreign language in school, but if they're not actually in that country using it every day, it's harder to maintain for sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how many languages do you speak?
Okay, well, right now, fluently, I speak English, Mandarin, and Cantonese, which I picked up when I was living in Hong Kong. And people sometimes were shocked that you could just pick it, because it is a very difficult language, but I think knowing Mandarin helps. And then in high school, I learned Japanese for 3 years. So I think if you give me 2 months in Japan, I can pick it up. And then during COVID, I got bored, so I started learning French for like 3 months. So in France, I can understand like maybe half pick words and try to make meanings of it. And I think I can read a decent amount of French. So I was told once you're fluent in 3 or 4 languages, and everything else just becomes easy. And I was like, all right, we'll get there.
Life goals.
Life goal. I'll also ask you, since you've lived in so many countries and sounds like an amazing, I'm sure, education journey and like childhood as well. Were there anything that you remember being challenging at all in any culture that you've lived in?
Well, I don't remember it as well because I was 2 years old, but I was learning Icelandic, English, French, and Turkish all at the same time. And I made some sort of Icelandic gibberish. So I had a communication challenge. Apparently, I would come home telling these amazing stories of what I did at school at the daycare center I was going to. And it was an Icelandic daycare center, hence why I was picking up Icelandic a lot. And my parents would just be like, and I would be frustrated that they weren't reacting to what I was saying.
Right.
So we knew right away we had to straighten out at least one of these languages, and English is, it is a global language. I think for me, one of the largest challenges after that, to be honest, was the moving around before the era of social media, which I'm now dating myself. I mean, maybe offices had access to email, right? But it wasn't something you found in the homes just yet. Not until I was in middle school. And then we started having dial-up and all of that. I remember we had Italia online in Milan, and I would have to connect to the internet. But anyway, moving around, I think, was the toughest part. Because I didn't know if I was ever going to see those friends that I had made. Once Facebook came around, I was actually able to reconnect with so many people that were at all corners of the world. I remember I had this one friend that I'd made when I was on a beach in Turkey. She was from the UK, and we would snail mail back and forth for the longest time. We became pen pals, basically. And that wasn't even like a move, right? Like that was just vacationing somewhere. But the snail mail really helped. I keep calling it snail mail. I don't post mail. I don't know. It really helped solidify those friendships because there is more effort that you put into it. And I still love receiving mail these days.
I've had postcards.
Postcards, yeah. So I think those would be the biggest things. At the beginning, it was language. And then it was getting comfortable with transitioning and making new friends every 2-3 years. Once we got to middle and high school, at that point, it was just how do you deal with social anxiety that every high schooler faces on top of the having to make new friends. Now you're trying to come into your own, you're trying to figure out who you are, what your identity is, and that's something that's hard for any high schooler.
Yeah.
But now you've added on this extra layer of doing that across multiple cultures, where you grew up and now where you are amongst other people who are also from different cultures and also third culture kids. It's a lot.
Yeah, and I think we talked about how high school is or can be for many people your formative years of how you perceive your identity and embrace your identity. Do you want to talk a little bit more on that? Like how going to a high school in France, how do you think that played a part in your identity?
Yeah. So I started high school in Milan and finished it in Paris. My high school in Milan was very small. There were like 20 people in my entire grade. So everyone knew everyone and everything. Moving to Paris was an adjustment because it was definitely a larger school. But I would say I was more set up for success because there's a lot of similarities between Italian and French culture. There's also a lot of differences, of course. My Italian was stronger than my French at the time. So I remember ordering at cafes in France and they would look at me and I'd be like, oh gosh, I just said that in Italian. I am so sorry. Ultimately, because I'd grown up French speaking for most of my life, I was definitely able to adapt to Parisian culture a lot faster. I also have family that lives in France, so that definitely helps. I love New York because it's multicultural. You've got people from everywhere here. It's the perfect place for someone who is a melting pot of cultures.
Yeah.
But if I ever want to feel a sense of home and belonging and coming back to something, I would say that France helps fulfill that for me.
Sometimes people have a hard time telling, I guess, where I grew up.
Tell us more about that.
So I think I think totally agree to your point about finding yourself during high school, like as a teenager, and even I think going to college, because I went to college here as well. I think for someone that young with that complex of an identity, coming here just felt quite overwhelming, for sure. But for me as well, I think because I really definitely pushed myself to embrace the culture while I was in Canada. I think that in terms of just being in North America, people couldn't really tell from my accent where I grew up. And sometimes I tell them, oh, this story, like I'm from China originally, blah, blah, blah. I just think people have a different set of assumptions depending on what you tell them. So they will only understand once you tell them the full story of your journey and how you approach culture and your own identity. So I think that was a challenge for me. Like, how do I consolidate all of these different cultural elements in my identity when I meet someone new and share that experience with them? Going back to Asia after undergrad also shaped my identity quite a bit. I think it allowed me to be closer to the culture that I was raised in as a younger person. So definitely my Chinese got better. You'd be surprised. I mean, I was like a middle school level, but I could not write a business email whatsoever. So those years I was like, okay, you gotta get this. I gotta nail this, this is the time to practice it. So that was great. But funny enough, while I was there, I was also able to meet many more multicultural friends. I think in undergrad, even when I was in New York, maybe you were just trying to search for people who are very similar in a way, and you don't know how to embrace like a diversity and sense. So a lot of my friends are Asian Americans or Asian Canadians, so very much embedded in the Asian community. I think I still am. But being back in Singapore and Hong Kong, like I made friends from Europe for the first time. Like one of my best friends, they're from the Netherlands and from France and from Korea, like everywhere. So that's when I actually really felt like, oh, okay, I can embrace the diversity in different cultures, like regardless of my upbringing. And it's funny, when I'm in Asia, everyone's like, you're so American. And then coming back here, I don't know what people think, but they definitely see me as Asian, like who grew up everywhere. Yeah. So I think different parts of your identity become more dominant as well, depending on your environment. So that's also very interesting.
It's funny you say that because we both have American accents for the most part, right? Sometimes they'll say, I detect some German in you. And I'm like, I do not speak German. But I have like a very standard accent. And that's mostly because a lot of the American international schools abroad have American English as their base. So it tends to be that a lot of third culture kids do have American accents, unless they went to a British school or whatnot. And I did have a British accent for a little while, actually, because I went to a British school in Mauritius. I learned.
Still do it?
I'm sorry. I don't know if I'm going to do it justice. Yeah, no, that already sounded awful. When I go back to France, yes, I speak French well, but they're like, wow, you speak really good French for an American.
Yay.
Oh, la petite américaine qui parle français, blah, blah, blah. Like, oh, and for my cousins, I'm la cousine américaine. Well, assume I'm American when they first meet me, and then I tell them my story, and then of course we all have like the short version and then the long version of our background, and then they start to realize, oh wow, you didn't grow up here, and yet she's technically American. So it's an interesting place where here I'm more born in France, so she's American, and I'm both. When I moved to the US, I moved from Paris to middle of nowhere, Virginia for college. And so for me, that was really challenging because I was moving into a very different environment. I grew up mostly in major cities. So now I'm going from city life to a small university town, and I was excited, but I was also nervous because am I going to be able to adapt to that kind of lifestyle? I didn't know how to drive a car. So I was 18, no license. I'm watching all these 15, 16 years old driving, and I'm like, I'm 18 and I don't even have a permit. And then the curriculum was very hard for me too, because I also took the International Baccalaureate, IB diploma. And so I felt like I was better situated to do essays and defend my arguments, like those types of exercises. And here it was multiple choice. right? Like, pick the right
One answer.
Only one answer. And I'm just not used to that. I also didn't get a chance to go to orientation and pick my classes like a lot of students do get to do in the summer. So I got stuck with all the bad teachers and the harder classes in my first semester. I found that people were more accepting of the fact that, oh, you're from somewhere else. Cool, tell me more. But sometimes when you're young and you're still growing up, even though you're in these American and international schools, people aren't adapting well to the culture. There's a lot of poking fun, right? There's still that like childish immaturity, and there's plants going in the, well, you know, we're trying to make it very green. Okay, there you go. I did not know much about pop culture. I only got acclimated to things like The Bachelor more recently. Just like any references. I didn't necessarily grow up with the same music. So it felt like another move to another foreign country where I'm going to be learning about the different cultures in the US, where I'm going to be learning how to live in a small town, how to drive, what Walmart is, things like that, right?
For undergrad as well, I remember coming in, and even though it's a pretty international school, I still feel that the majority of people grew up in the US or are very familiar with, you know, pop culture and everything here. And I remember so many times, I don't remember the exact incident, where they'll be talking about something and I was like, what's that?
Yeah.
And then people will be like, you don't know
You don't know? You've not heard of this? How? Where?
I've been to IHOP? And I was like, wow, like, I mean, thinking back, it's hilarious. Like, those are the things that we get insecure about sometimes, which is kind of wild. So that's definitely like one level of culture shock, which I think in Canada people were much more, I don't know if just my friend circle or the family I was with, like people were so much more open-minded and accommodating towards newcomers and people who are not familiar with the culture. Versus in New York, I was like, okay, I gotta get up to speed, I gotta blend in, I gotta be a New Yorker, I need to understand what people are talking about, and I just be part of the group, like the community.
Yeah.
I think that played well in the sense that I did really push myself to adapt. But I think the downside, you're definitely losing a bit of your own cultural identity because you're trying so hard to blend in.
Yeah.
So that's why going back to English, I think that was really good for me as a reminder that my roots and my culture, it was very, very strong, especially working in a business setting with clients and colleagues from all different cultures. There's just a lot that I had to get used to again, like writing business emails or building business relationships in, let's say, China, for example. It's just a very different world. And also because I was working in an American company, so you serve as that voice for the company in the region, helping your clients and people understand what your business is and where you stand, but also helping the business understand the market. It was not an easy role, but I do think it was a good identity journey for me to be able to play that up in a way that, hey, look, I understand both sides. Let's figure out a way to make this work. Yeah, I think that was definitely like a reverse culture shock coming back to the US again. I don't think there's much shock at this point. It's more about just noticing things that I didn't notice before. Now that I was out of the country for a while, I was like, okay, this is a very America-centric way of thinking, right? Or way of doing things, which I didn't think about before, which I used to think as the default way of so that was a good sense of
That is an interesting perspective. And actually, it's a perfect segue. I think we've talked a lot about third culture kid life growing up. And now that we are both adults, how have you navigated your career, and what would you say are the things that are most important to you given how you grew up?
Oh, that's a great question, which I should probably give a time to reflect on.
I threw you off.
I actually just finished my MBA, and I think being in school and being in that bubble, I was with 40% international students at MIT, like at Sloan, so it's a wildly diverse kind of community. And I definitely think my approach to cultures in general was taken up on a different level because I was exposed to so many new cultures. Like, I actually never knew anyone who is from Senegal or from other parts of Africa. I'd never been until this January. And that was such a crazy experience, and I loved it. I also went to South America for the first time. Many countries, never met anyone from Chile, from Peru, from Brazil, so that's such an interesting journey. And then now you can throw me anyone from any of those countries, I would know, okay, I know something about their country and their culture, and it's just so much easier to start that relationship, I would say. I think in terms of career, we should redo this in a year.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be fun. 1 year revisit it. I like that idea.
Yeah. I think if there is an environment that would allow me to use my strength in understanding different cultures and navigating different personalities and business practices, that would be awesome. It'd be really cool one day if I get sent somewhere to a new market to set up a new office or just run a different region, then to balance that with obviously skill sets that I want to learn and also learn a little bit more about the US markets inside many ways. Yeah. So it's an interesting question. I think when the opportunities come, I'll have to weigh what has to come first and if I have to choose what's the right route to.
Yeah. Your career choices will evolve over time. So what you want to do today could evolve into something different in 5-10 years. So that's totally fine. My first job was not anything to do with my major at all, which I think is very typical, right? But you're trying to find your way. We'll take whatever job can at least get you starting to live on your own. I grew up as an only child, so I was already pretty independent. I found that I really wanted to make an impact globally, but what did that really mean? And eventually I found myself working with a French company that helped me have affiliations back in France and work with the team that was already there, but also still be here in the US and representing our US marketing. So I found that it helped me with relationships. Building relationships across different managers with different stakeholders. And it also allowed me to understand where someone else is coming from when they're making a decision or why they see it this way or, things like that. And I think third culture kids do have a unique ability to thrive in a lot of business settings just based off of their own experiences. And I think that should be leveraged more. The more that third culture kids talk about their experiences, the more awareness it brings to light across people all over the world. I love to travel for work, so if I can get any travel opportunity, discover a new place, I always tack on like an extra couple of days to be able to just learn something new. There are a lot of places I've gone back to that I went to as a kid, and it's an entirely new experience. I would love for more third culture kids to come together and share their professional experiences and help each other out. It's something that I'm thinking about in my future, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, I think just having this conversation here is a great start.
Yeah, I totally agree. I never thought that this would be something that I should actively think about it in a way. Like, it's so much embedded in my identity. If I meet someone, I was like, oh yeah, you understand. But I think community is so important, and then it's always just important to vocalize that, and then just sometimes label it as what you are and what the identity that you embrace. Yeah, and transferring that identity into skills in a business setting or at work is underrated. I do think there is a systemic challenge where only if your manager or hiring manager or your team has that experience or background or some experience with that, it's a little bit hard for them to speak about that coming from their culture, so which I absolutely would aspire to change. It should be listed on the job description.
Yes.
Their culture.
Yeah. I actually put on my resume the international experience that I have. A lot of people might perceive this as bragging or whatnot, but this is actually my life. We moved around not by my choice. It was my parents' decision, right? So this is just how I lived. In France, I would say that colleagues become a little bit like family. Like, you have them over to your home, you have drinks, you have like work drinks at home, things like that. Here in the US, maybe you'll meet at a bar or something like that, and there's more of a separation between work and life. And here it's more live to work, whereas in Europe, it's more work to live. I always have to strive that balance because sometimes I'm just really ambitious, but sometimes overly so, or sometimes I just want to find ways to enjoy life. So it just depends on the day, but that makes us flexible, adaptable, and so that's an important part in figuring out what you want the most out of your career.
Yeah. Sidetrack, but hot take. What do you think of Emily? This was not in the script.
So my French side is like, oh my gosh, really? And then my American side is like, this is so cute. Okay. I do admire how people express themselves with clothing and fashion. Having grown up in Milan and Paris, that's definitely been at the forefront. And so watching Emily in Paris is kind of fun. It's not necessarily reality, but they tease out certain elements they're exaggerated, but there is some like underlying truth in some ways, right? Like fitting in, understanding cultural norms, interacting with people from another culture, understanding the language, not being able to speak it. Like all of those things do happen. Of course, they just play it up a lot in Emily in Paris.
Yeah, I think every character is also exaggerated.
Oh, yeah.
I remembered it because you said the live to work and work to live line. And I remember, I think it was Brooke who said something like that to Emily when she was like stressed out at work and showing up at 8 when everybody else shows up at 10 and all that. So I think with my limited understanding of French culture and work culture there, I totally agree that there is some truth that they're trying to embed in the show culturally.
Yeah, I mean, you take a siesta in Spain, right? Everyone takes a couple of hours to actually go to a restaurant, have lunch, then go back to work. Yes, you start later, but you probably end up working a little later, but you also have your meals later. So, I mean, it's just a very different way of life. And so being able to kind of accept it, adopt certain elements of it, just definitely makes you more flexible. And there's a lot of benefits to that for sure. But there's also a lot of benefits to the hustle culture that you find here, right? My challenge is always how can I blend the two together in a way that works for me and that I can also help others that are going through the same questions in their life.
I think you're doing it. So wondering content and you have your corporate life. We're getting at when I was in Singapore, I think there was a much bigger lunch culture, obviously company dependent, but I think in many parts of Asia, well, some parts of Asia, there is that work, culture of being very close to your colleagues, and people invite colleagues to weddings. Like I've attended 2 colleagues' wedding in Jakarta and in other parts of Southeast Asia, just because we're old friends and we actually hung out quite a bit outside of work. And I remember at that time I was sharing this with some of my friends who were working here, and they were so shocked. They couldn't believe that you hang out with your colleagues outside of your work. Like that sounds unheard of.
Oh, wow.
So that's when I realized, that's very interesting. And definitely coming back, it'll be a new discovery, and I'm excited to see how that pans out. But ideally, of course, I would also love to be in an environment where people are a bit more open to building relationships with your colleagues at a more personal level. I understand that, people have their boundaries and some people prefer to keep things separate, but I do think we're all human at the end of the day. And it's really important to just know someone more personally, and I think that explains a lot of how they approach work, how they think, and it's more for like your understanding so that you can better work with them. It's not so much that you have to know everything about your colleagues, figuring out their life story. I think the more you understand each other, the more you're able to accommodate and collaborate. That's just my personal.
I think the world is definitely leaning more towards that. There are some industries where it is more normal to bond. Maybe people are in the same stage of life. You will obviously connect and do some things outside of work together. I think as you grow older and you have families, things like that, it gets a little bit more challenging. The idea here is that bridging the gap, realizing everyone's human, learning from each other, and bringing your authentic self to work so that people can really get to know you. And I see that just as a general thing, not just as a third culture kid thing. I think there's now an emphasis of like, how can you be authentically yourself in the workplace so that you can bring your ideas safely, so that others can connect with you, so that you can brainstorm together. That is really important, no matter your background. I can learn from someone who was born and raised in one place all their life. I don't know what it's like to have a home and place that you go back to often, where you're still living in the same house after all these years. I've never lived anywhere for more than 6 years in my entire life. Ultimately, if you can bring your authentic self to work, I think a lot of good change and positive impact can happen.
Love that. So good. Should we do one last one to close?
Okay.
Anything else? If you could live in a different culture again, let's say assuming you don't have to worry about, work or
visas
and all that. Like that's all sorted. What's the culture that would intrigue you the most to want to? You define the timeline. It doesn't have to. That's right.
I do love New York. I see myself here for the long run. And it's because of the culture here. Like New York culture is very much, I can identify with it. But I also have strong ties back to France. So I think it's important for me to keep French culture in my life. And so being able to go back frequently, maybe split some time back and forth would be awesome. But I've never been to Portugal. I might have gone to Portugal when I was like 2 months old or something. I don't remember it, so that doesn't count. I've heard great things about Portuguese culture, about the architecture.
Would you say you're get intrigued about the culture, but also quality of life?
Yeah.
Because I heard great things as well.
I don't know if Portugal is a blue zone. I'll have to pull up the definition again, and I'll put it in the description box. But essentially, there's a very good sense of community, very good weather. The diet is mostly Mediterranean. Like even Japan, actually, I think is considered a blue zone region. Yeah, it's very whole, very fresh. Community is very strong. When they say it takes a village to raise a child or whatnot, like a whole village comes together. So from what I've heard about Portugal, or just any of those regions, like even the south of France, parts of Spain, Portugal, Italy, like those are regions where family, emotional support, good nutrition, those are very much valued, especially the good food. I miss that.
It's interesting. I think my partner would highly disagree with. I've always had this idea of living in emerging markets. I guess when I was living in China, like 2000, is when obviously the economy was growing really quickly, and you see changes happening every year, and the Beijing Olympics, like all of that. So I feel like that was quite a thrilling experience that you don't get necessarily in developed markets or economies. There's a different set of challenge that you have to address. Obviously things are more chaotic, doing business much more difficult because of the lack of structure and systems in place. So things are definitely more chaotic that way. But I do think it's the culture among the people, and also just in that developing cycle is really interesting to me. And I'm a huge foodie. Like, food has to be really good.
Food is key.
I went to Africa because I was so interested, and I'm still very, very interested in just the different countries. A huge continent, 54 countries, and I knew like 1% of it. So I think that's definitely in my mind of like, oh, I would love to learn more about it in the future. I will say though, I think the food scene in Kenya wasn't as okay, I'm gonna get canceled for saying this. Yeah. I feel like the food scene was a little different from what I expected. Versus, for example, when I traveled to Central America and South America, I absolutely fell in love with food, and I eat that every day. The challenge there is that I have to learn Spanish. Different set of, learning. I think somewhere probably in the emerging world where it has good food and people are nice, and I think that would be a really good lifestyle as well.
Yeah,
especially if you can earn expat salary.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's awesome that you want to explore more of the emerging markets, because there's a lot there, and I don't think they get enough exposure. Food is definitely the language of love in a lot of places. I've learned a lot through food, actually. So I recently found out I have celiac disease. And I grew up on pastas in Italy, right? And pizzas. I learned that the wheat, the way it's processed in Europe, is very different in the US. So generally speaking, the way foods are pulled together and farmed and raised and processed are just very different across cultures too. So like a tomato in Turkey will taste different than a tomato here. So just even those basics, I love to just compare, contrast. There's just something about it.
That was fun.
That was a lot of fun. I'm really glad we got to do that.
Yeah, same. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do some of these topics, do a deep dive at some point.
Yeah.
It'll be really fun. We'll see what we can come up with.
Thanks so much for joining.
Hope to see you guys soon again.
Yes. Take care. Bye.